we are looking at 2 Samuel chapter 13. And this is an interesting chapter because it starts out to be about Amnon, but then before long we get introduced to, well, it's not the first time he's come around, but we get a better feel for the character of Absalom, who was one of David's sons. Amnon is also one of David's sons, but Absalom will figure in the next several chapters as he kind of leads a revolution against David. Actually ends up running David out of Jerusalem before he is finally defeated. So it's the beginning of an interesting sort of cycle in the whole series, in the whole book of 2 Samuel. One of the things that these books served to do was to help people as they were studying Israel's history to understand the succession of the kings, how one king followed another and why one king followed another. For example, when Solomon ascended to the throne, a lot of people might have said, well, goodness, he wasn't the firstborn. He wasn't, he wasn't of any particular lineage that would make us want to look at him as opposed to some of the other sons of David. And so that's part of what these books do, is they help us understand what all else went on and who the other sort of options were, because obviously David had many sons. If we back in 2 Samuel chapter 3, there's a list of Samuel's sons, and as we looked at that list when we're back that far, that's before we even got to Solomon. So these were all David's sons before he even came to Jerusalem. And that's, of course, where we find Amnon, who was the firstborn of David, and Absalom, who's actually David's third son. So, in fact, if you're looking back at 2 Samuel chapter 3, in verse 3, it says that Absalom was the son of Maacah, who was the daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. And while, your eyes kind of glaze over when you read that stuff normally, just kind of keep maybe a finger in there, or just remember that Absalom is then, therefore, the grandson of the king of Geshur, which is a neighboring country, and you'll see why that's important as we go through this particular chapter. As we begin looking at this chapter, one of the things that we'll see is that we'll begin to get a feel for Absalom's character. And that's one of the things we'll want to do, is because as we go through a little bit further into 2 Samuel, Absalom, as I said, plays a much bigger role, and it's nice for us to have sort of a feel of who he is and the kind of things that he is willing to do. We also get a feel for David's firstborn son, who would, I suppose, normally have been the crown prince. He would have been the one who would ascend next to the throne following David. And his name is Amnon. And he was, of course, listed in 2 Samuel chapter 3 as it lists David's sons. And one of the things that we learn about Amnon is that he shares some of his father's least desirable qualities. He is a woman's man in the sense that he likes his ladies. And one of his problems is that, kind of like David, and as we saw with the situation with Bathsheba, he seems to like the ladies that he has no business liking. He seems to like the ones that are really unavailable to him. And then, of course, like his father, he makes them or forces them to become available. And we'll see the tragedy that ensues as a result of that. So let's start looking at the chapter, and we begin with verse 1. It says, in the course of time, of course this chapter takes place after the situation with David and Bathsheba, and then after the fall of Rabbah, where Joab finally captured the city, and then David came and attacked it and brought the slaves back to Jerusalem. So it tells us in the beginning of chapter 13 that Amnon fell in love with Tamar. Apparently she was beautiful. And I don't know what Absalom and Tamar's mother was like, but apparently both Absalom and Tamar were strikingly attractive. Tamar apparently is beautiful, and Absalom is also described as being handsome. So apparently their mother must have been lovely as well. However, Amnon knows that she is his half-sister in the first place, and in the second place, it says also in verse 2 that she is a virgin, or the word is actually young maiden, and that's that same word that people argue about from Isaiah chapter 9, where it says the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Well, was it a virgin? Was it a young maiden? The word doesn't necessitate that she has never had sexual intercourse. It's not virgin in that sense. But it is virgin in what I guess you would call the social sense, that it was expected that she would not have had sexual intercourse because she's a young lady, she's of marriageable age. And I think in the court of David, and because she is specifically the daughter of the king, that makes her desirable so that, they might marry her off to another king in order to seal a relationship between their two nations. So that's another reason why she was pretty well out of bounds for Amnon, because if he had relations with her and if she was therefore spoiled, then she would not be available to be used to help seal a treaty or something along those lines. So in verse 2 it says that Amnon was frustrated and that she was not available to him. But it's kind of sad when you look at the wording at the very end of verse 2. It says that he was not able to do anything to her. And at first you kind of think, well, that's a little forward, isn't it? That sounds a little terrible. But as we go further into the chapter, you'll find that that's probably exactly the kind of attitude that Amnon had, that he wanted this woman, and he knew very well what it was he wanted to do to her, not so much with her. And so it was a bad situation. And it said that he was frustrated even to the point of illness. So he was literally, if you will, making himself sick over this. Now we are also introduced to a third character, Jonadab. And Jonadab is actually David's nephew. He is the son of one of David's brothers. So that would make him Amnon's cousin. And now all of these young men have grown up and have been a part of David's court. And so they are young men now. They're not, kind of teenagers. They're not, early 20s. They are young men in and of their own rights. And one of the things we'll learn about Jonadab is the kind of person he was. He was in many ways, the consummate politician. It says, he's described in verse 3 as a very shrewd man. This is the NIV version. The Hebrew word is kakam, which is most often translated wise, so it would say that he was a wise man. But I think the reason that they went for the word shrewd in verse 3 in the NIV is because what we'll see that Jonadab is doing is actually advising Amnon in an immoral activity. Because if he's helping arrange for Amnon to have Tamar, that's something he really shouldn't be doing, neither Amnon nor Jonadab. So not really sure about this character of Jonadab. What is he doing here? Is he, being involved in activities he should not be? Or is he maybe just as fooled by Amnon as everyone else is? Or maybe because he realizes that Amnon is the crown prince, maybe he's trying to get in his good graces so that when Amnon ascends the throne, as it seems like he might, that Jonadab then may have a nice position as an advisor or something along those lines. So whatever the reason, it doesn't give us very much detail. We do have this character of Jonadab, and he seems to be good at arranging things because that's what he does here. And so in verse 4, he notices how upset Amnon is. It doesn't say he knows why exactly, but as I said, Amnon was making himself ill with all of this business with Tamar. And so he comes to Amnon, he says, "Why are you looking so haggard? Won't you tell me why?" And he's looking, if there's something I can do to help you, let me know. And so Amnon confesses to Jonadab, says, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." So it's really, as we've said, that Tamar then is Amnon's half-sister. So Jonadab then comes up with this plan, and it's kind of an interesting plan. It's a little bit kind of convoluted, but as we see in the story, it actually works quite well. And so what he says in verse 5, Jonadab advises Amnon. He says, "Go to bed and pretend to be ill." It wouldn't be any great stretch, because anyone who's paying attention already has noticed, as Jonadab has, that Amnon is not looking so good. So Jonadab has this plan. He says, go to bed and pretend to be ill, and then when your father comes to see you, say to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so that I may watch her and then eat it from her hand." So this is the plan that Jonadab comes up with. And here's the first point that I think is a good touchstone for us as we think about, well, when we read this, how do we apply it then to our lives? I mean, how does any of this have anything to do with us? And here's this character of Jonadab, who, as we've mentioned, is wise or shrewd, however you want to translate that particular word. But it's apparently a gift that he has. It is a skill that he has. And if you want to say that it's a gift of God, however you want to look at it, it certainly is something that God has helped him develop in his life. And what we need to understand is that when we have certain gifts and skills that are given to us, we might say by God, we should be sure and use those gifts and skills in a way that is honoring to God. Jonadab clearly has political skills, but in this case, he's using them in ways that not only are not honoring to God, but also do great damage, great harm, not only to Tamar, but ultimately, as you'll see, to Amnon himself. So while it seems like Jonadab has come up with this great plan and he's going to help out Amnon, what ends up happening is just disaster. So let's go through the story and see what happens. In verse 6, Amnon follows Jonadab's advice. And sure enough, I guess, when David hears that his eldest son is sick in bed, he comes to see what's going on. So the king comes to see him, and Amnon says, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make me some special bread in my sight so that I may eat from her hand." And then in verse 7, in what is really quite an ironic statement or ironic situation, it ultimately comes down to David as the one who sort of puts these two together. Tamar goes to Amnon because David told her to. And David is the one who has, committed adultery previously, not only adultery but murder, and yet now he is complicitous in this action as well. Now he's not knowledgeably complicitous, he doesn't know what's going on, but he's the one who makes it happen, and Tamar probably wouldn't have gone unless David had asked her to do so. And because David asked her, in verse 8 it says, "She went to the house of her brother Amnon, and he was lying down. apparently on the couch or somewhere out in the room where where the kitchen is. And she made a meal for him. She took dough, she kneaded it, she baked it, and she took the pan and began to serve him the bread. But out there in the main room, he refused to eat. He said, "No, I just can't eat." And so he sends everyone away. And then in verse 10, he says to Tamar, "Bring the food into my bedroom so I will eat from your hand." Well, we already can kind of see where this is going. And so Tamar, being, a good heart, a good soul, whether she suspects something or not, doesn't say, but she brought the bread into her brother Amnon in his bedroom. But when she went to hand it to him, you can just see him, grabbing her by the wrists, and he's just grabbing hold of her. And he says to her, this is the NIV, it says, "Come to bed with me." What he says to her is, "Come lie with me." And the reason that that's a significant word, it's the Hebrew word shakab, and it has overtones of undisciplined self-indulgence. He's clearly kind of forcing himself. He's overcoming her. He's not doing something. He's not saying, "Come share my bed." He's saying, "Come lie with me." It's a very lustful act as opposed to a loving act. And Tamar has, you can tell she has a good education and that she's the daughter of a king. She has her own kind of strength of will, and she is well spoken. And when she speaks to her brother, she responds to him in verse 12 and reminds him of several things that should have put the brakes on this whole situation. I mean, certainly we can see how things can develop quickly. But what she said, had he been listening and had he been paying attention, he would have said, "Oh, you're right, I need to stop." First of all, in verse 12, she calls him my brother. And that obviously is a relationship that this type of action is inappropriate. The second thing she says to him in verse 12 is translated in the NIV here, says, "Do not force me." That's the Hebrew word anah, which means to afflict, and it can mean to humiliate someone. It means to bring this upon a person in a forceful way. And so she's saying, don't do this thing forcefully. And then at the end of verse 12, she brings up a third point, which really should have been kind of the final icing on the cake. She says, "Such a thing should not be done in Israel." Don't do this, and this is the NIV, so it says wicked thing, but there are many translations that will say, "Do not do this foolish things," or "don't do this folly." And that's because, if you remember earlier, when David encountered Nabal, and we talked about his name, that meant fool, and then his wife Abigail, and you remember that whole story. Well, this is Nabal is part of that as a root word, because this is Nabalah, which means foolish, but it can also mean disgraceful. And one commentator says it can even have the connotation of being godless, because it's Nabalah, as we know, the folks in Arabic refer to God as Allah. So it can mean godless, or not with not God action. And that's a powerful statement for her to say, this is something that Israel should not do. This is a thing that is against God. This is a thing that, an action you should clearly not take. It's a forceful action to make me do something I don't want to do. But then in verse 13, on top of all of that she's already said, she addresses him in a different way. She says, think about me, think about my feelings, think about what this will do to me. She says, there would be no way that I could get rid of my disgrace, the disgrace that will come upon me as a result of this. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, what about you? While the disgrace would come upon me, she said, if you do this thing, you will be seen as a wicked fool. And, if he's the next in line to be king, that's not the kind of reputation that you want, right? You want to be known as a good person, a wise person. And this is something that she says, this is not something that you should do. But she understands that he has this strong longing for her, and she introduces the idea in the end of verse 13 that it may be a relationship that the king would allow if you would bring it to him and go through the proper channels and allow him to do so. Because they weren't blood brother and sister, they were more like first cousins. So she says that, the king may allow this if you would, if you bring it before the king. But verse 14, he's got a hold of her, and he's in the throes of passion and lust, and he's not going to let go. And verse 14 says he refused to listen to her, and he was stronger. And so this is the NIV, and it says he raped her. But the literal translation is that he forcibly lay with her. It uses those very same two words, do not force me, and he said previously, come lay with me. And those are the two things that she said, no, 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 no. And then that's the very thing that he did. It says in Hebrew, it uses those same two words. He forcibly lay with her. So that's kind of the culmination of that story. Then in verse 15, we have this really interesting kind of psychological analysis of the whole situation. Because you have all of this that has gone on up until this point. Ammon has this, powerful lust, although he said initially that he was in love with her. Doesn't seem like very much love to me, but that's what he said. But once he has forced himself upon her, verse 15 says, and this is really interesting psychological verse, says, Ammon hated her with an intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Wow. So that the intensity of that emotion just flips completely 180 degrees. And so now Ammon tells her, he says, get up and get out. He's throwing her literally, not just out of his bed, but out of the house. Here again, we see a little bit more into the character of Tamar. She is, as I said, well-spoken. She understands her situation. And she stands up for herself as much as she possibly can. Obviously, when she is being physically overwhelmed, there's not only so much she can do. But in verse 16, she says, no, I'm not going to get up and get out. And then she points out to him that by sending me away, it would be a greater wrong than what you have already done. Because she would then be a violated woman, and she has no recourse to anything. If he just has his way and sends her off, then she has nothing that she can claim for herself. But again, in verse 16, it says he did not listen to her. He refused to listen to her. So he's almost like got his fingers in his ears. He doesn't want to hear anything that she has to say. And as we can see by reading what she has to say, that she's fairly well spoken. So I guess because she refused to leave, in verse 17, he calls his servant in and has her forcibly removed from the house, puts her outside, and bolted the door. And that's what the servant does. She was apparently wearing a specially ornamented robe that was for those virgin daughters of the king. So she has this beautiful robe. It noted her status, but she knows now that her status is destroyed. And so in an act of grief and sorrow, as you also hear, they tore their clothes, so she tore the robe. Also, it says that she put ashes on her head. That too is an act of sorrow, an act of grief. But it says she went away weeping aloud. So she had to leave, because where else she's going to go. But she makes such a fuss that everyone who saw her saw the robe torn, they saw the ashes on her head, they heard her screaming, her weeping. Everybody knew what had happened and who had done what to whom. And so while she has no recourse, she wants to make sure that everyone knows what's going on. So in this day and age, we might call her a whistleblower. We might, say, well, she's willing to say this is what happened. She doesn't wait until, days or even years later to say it. She lets them know right then and there exactly what happened. And so it's very clear to everyone what's happened. So, as it becomes clear to everyone around her, one of the first people to respond is her brother Absalom. And he responds in verse 20, and he knows exactly because of her actions what Amnon has done. And so he point blank asks her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? And she doesn't respond, but he tells her to be quiet and don't take this thing to heart. Now you might think that Absalom is taking action to where he's just going to sweep this whole thing under the rug and say, oh, this is the king's son, we have to let him get away with whatever he wants to get away with. And you almost wonder whether Tamar feels the same way. She feels like, well, after all this, are you going to kind of take sides with him? Because Absalom's not making a fuss about it. He's not bringing it to the king and saying, demanding justice kind of thing, which is what you might expect. But he doesn't. In fact, what he does do is to take his sister into his house, and because she's no longer, desirable as a woman to a lot of people because she's been violated, he brings her into his own house, and he's going to look after her. He's going to take care of her, make sure she has a place in the family. Then we get to verse 21. So we see what Absalom does when he finds out. He acts with compassion towards Tamar. When King David heard about it, and it says in verse 21, it says, he was furious. He was very angry. Well, of course he should be. Here's the thing. David doesn't do anything. He doesn't take action against Amnon. He doesn't take action to support Tamar. Maybe he said, well, Absalom's already done that, so I don't have to. But however you look at it, David, in his quote-unquote righteous anger, is not very righteous, because he doesn't really do anything to help or to make sure that justice is done. And it's kind of odd, because David is the one to whom people would appeal if they felt like in their own situations that their justice had not been done. And yet in his own family, he can't make sure that justice is done. And this is another point that I want to kind of grab hold of and say, in our own lives, in our own situations, when we see in the world things that are wrong, things that we would say, that's not good, that's not right, it's one thing for us to be angry about those things, but if we never take any action, if we never take any steps to right whatever is wrong, how are we any better than David? How are we actually helping the situation? Maybe we're not helping the situation, and that's kind of the point. So then we get in the end of this section, verse 22. Absalom didn't say anything to Amnon. He did not speak to Amnon. Now you might think of that as well, he's sort of freezing him out, but at the same way also he doesn't confront Amnon and say, what have you done to my sister, etc., etc. There's not a big clash, which is what you would expect. It says Absalom did not say a word to Amnon, either good or bad, but you read in the end of verse 22, here's where we find out what Absalom thinks. It says he hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. So, while David is angry, in Absalom it engenders hatred. which is a different emotion. You can be angry about an action and not necessarily hate the person, but Absalom doesn't say that he's angry about the action, it just says that he hated Amnon. And there's an old saying that said, revenge is a dish best served cold. Have you ever heard that one? Yeah. Absalom bides his time. And we find out that's why he didn't say anything. He didn't want anyone to know just how angry he was or just how much he hated Amnon. He probably just kind of stayed clear of him, didn't really talk to him much, kind of avoided him if possible. 2 years later, okay, that's a long time. Things have definitely cooled off, settled down. Some people have forgotten all about it, but not Absalom. 2 years later, it's the springtime, it's the time of sheep shearing, and just like, there are, in many cultures, harvest festivals. There are times when you bring in the harvest and they have a big feast and everyone rejoices that the harvest has been good. A similar thing happens at sheep shearing time, because if the wool is good, it looks like there's going to be a good crop and a lot of fleece and everybody's happy about that, then they would have a festival, they would have a feast. And so, sure enough, they're going to have a feast, and Absalom invites the king and all of the king's sons. Well, he's inviting everybody so that it doesn't look suspicious that he invites Amnon. If he invites everybody, Amnon's just one of everybody as opposed to being sort of singled out. He invites everybody. King David says, no, I'm not going to come, and the reason he gives is kind of awkward, and it makes you wonder whether he has some kind of suspicions of his own, because he says, no, it would be too much of a burden. But Absalom said, oh, please bring them, and David says no, but David gives his blessing, and that's in verse 25. Then in verse 26, Absalom says, well, if you can't come, make sure your son comes. And just like, if you think of royalty today, perhaps in Great Britain, if the queen can't come, she'll send one of the princes, particularly the next in line. And so Absalom says, well, if you can't come, then send my brother Amnon, because he's obviously the crown prince. And I think in verse 26, David is getting a little suspicious, because he says, why should he go to you? David knows that there's bad blood between them. It's been 2 years, but he still remembers. And he says, why should he go to you? But it says, verse 27, because Absalom urged him, then Amnon and the rest of the king's sons went. So Amnon didn't go by himself, but all of the king's sons, or at least a good number of them, went. Now, when Absalom specifically asked for Amnon, I think he almost overstepped. He almost sort of revealed what his plan was, and even David, I think, got a little suspicious at that point. But it says that Absalom insisted, and Amnon and the other of the king's sons came to the party. Now we find out what Absalom's plan is in verse 28. Absalom orders his men, and it says, when Amnon is high spirits from drinking, he said, I will say to you, strike him down, and then kill him. Don't be afraid. I have given you this order. Be strong and brave. Imagine if you're one of Absalom's men. Where does your loyalty lie? Is it to Absalom, or is it to, the king? Because what they're basically asking him to do is to assassinate the crown prince. And that's why Absalom encourages him. He says, I've given you this order, so ultimately he's saying that the guilt and the blame will fall upon me. He says, and then he encourages them, says, be strong and brave. So he's trying to encourage them, and he's waiting until Amnon has had plenty to drink, so he won't be much in terms of defending himself. And verse 29 says, so Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. They apparently assassinated him, And the end of verse 29, you can just imagine all heck breaks loose and there's chaos and what's happened? Oh no! People are running everywhere. It says the king's sons got up, mounted their mules and fled. You can just imagine them all heading out in different directions. And so off they go. Well, first thing that's going to happen when something like this occurs is that somebody's going to bring the report to David. And so in verse 30, they bring the report, but it's not accurate. They bring the report that all of his sons have been killed, that Absalom has killed them all. And of course, David responds in verse 31 by tearing his clothes and falling down on the ground. And his servants all stood by, and they tore their clothes as well. But then we had verse 32. Here comes Jonadab again. And isn't he the one who started this whole mess? He's the one who gave Amnon the idea, or helped him to find out how to do this with Tamar. And now he's bringing, well, you could say that it's reassurance to David. So you sort of wonder, whose side is Jonadab really on? And maybe that sort of by itself answers the question, is that he's going to be on his own side, so whatever's good for him. But it also, because now he's trying to say something to comfort the king, it also makes you wonder, well, what was his motivation earlier? Maybe he didn't think that Amnon would take it so far. Maybe he didn't really know what Amnon had in mind, if Amnon actually had anything in mind. But here, he comforts David, even though the word is that Absalom has killed all the king's sons. Jonadab says, no, I don't think he would do that. He says, only Amnon is dead. And so, now whether that means Jonadab had prior knowledge of what Absalom had in mind, or whether he could just kind of see the writing on the wall and say, well, I can tell what's going to happen here. Ultimately, there's going to be, this is all going to fall apart, and Absalom's going to kill Amnon. What he says to David in the end of verse 32 is, this has been Absalom's expressed intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. So it doesn't say that Absalom said anything. In fact, what the scripture says is that he basically kept quiet, or at least to Amnon. So he didn't make it known publicly. Perhaps he made it known to Jonadab, perhaps maybe just to a few close insiders knew how angry Absalom was. But in verse 33, Jonadab tries to comfort the king. He said, my lord the king should not be concerned about the report that all your sons are dead, only Amnon is dead. So that's at least what kind of comfort he can give to the king. So, verse 34, now once Absalom has done this, he knows that his own situation is quite precarious. And so it says that he fled. And it doesn't say where he fled just yet, but we'll find that out in a second. And then whoever is standing watch in Jerusalem saw people coming down the road and told the king, I saw people coming down the road. And Jonadab says to the king in verse 35, see, the king's sons are back. It's just as your servant had said. So Amnon again is kind of trying, hopefully he's trying to encourage the king. He's trying to help him feel better, but it's like he's also building himself up in the process of doing that. He's saying, oh, see, I was right all along. I had it right. And so he's kind of building himself up in the eyes of the king. And of course, verse 36 says that when he finished speaking, the king's son came in, and they were all wailing, and the king too, and the servants all wept bitterly. So there was much weeping and gnashing of teeth over this particular incident, as you can well imagine. Then we find out what happened to Absalom in verse 37. It says, Absalom fled, and he went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. Now remember when I said earlier that we should remember who Absalom's grandfather is. This is his mother's father. Well, if you're in trouble with your father and with your father's family, the place to flee is to your mother's family. And that's exactly what he does. And because he was the grandson, I guess you'd say, of royalty, he's in this other country of Geshur, and so he's not really in a place where he can be brought back to the king and tried for his crimes. The interesting thing about verse 37 is once we kind of get this picture that Absalom has found kind of a safe place to hide, what the end of verse 37 says that King David mourned for his son every day. And at first you're kind of wondering, well, which son is he mourning for? Is he mourning for Amnon? Is he mourning for Absalom? And we might think that he was mourning for Amnon until we read in verse 38 where it says, Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and he stayed there 3 years. And verse 39 says, the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So he sort of got over Amnon, but he's still concerned for Absalom. That's the one that he wants to see. But he's not able to do that because, you know, if he were to bring Absalom back, then surely somebody would say, well, you know, Absalom then needs to answer for his crimes. So all of this is going on, and David's concern is not for the dead. He's not looking to the past. He's looking forward. He's looking to the future. He wants to be reunited with his son Absalom. And I think as we look at David, and a lot of times we look at David and say, well, he embodies many characteristics that are godly characteristics, many ungodly ones as well. But in terms of godly ones, here is one that I think we can grab hold of and say that as God looks at us, we know how much we have done. We know all the things that we have done that have been an affront to God, ways that we have sinned against God. And yet, when we have strayed and we've gone away, God still desires us, God still loves us, and God still wants to embrace us and call us back to himself.